Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new compilation from Sounds from the Ground, Through the Ages 2. Sounds from the Ground, Nick Wolfson and Elliot Morgan-Jones. Hopefully we're no stranger to this dub chill-out duo on this channel. I've highlighted them many times as one of my personal favorite bands of all time. They have among the most consistent track records, if not the most consistent I've ever seen in electronic music. They have yet to release an album that isn't at least really solid in mid-high 7 range for me, and the vast majority are in the 8 range somewhere, with basically all of them delivering their own unique flavor that's different from all the others, but still exemplifies their style. They mean so much to me personally, as I've already detailed many times in the past. Though, I will admit going into this particular project I wasn't as excited as I usually am when they drop something, and there's a few reasons for that. First of all, we've come off the heels of one of their weaker projects in a while, Binary from last year. That project, again, was still really good and brought me back in quite a bit over the course of the year, but they didn't really feel like they were pushing themselves or delivering any of their best ever tracks. There were certainly plenty of good tracks and creative ideas on Binary, enough to still merit an honorable mention on the year-end list. But I typically have higher expectations for what they can usually deliver, and it felt like they were kind of playing it safe. It was kind of a letdown, especially coming after their previous album, Native Soul, which was not only my second favorite album of 2017, but maybe even my favorite project they put out in the 2010s overall. Another reason I was kind of worried about this, as you can tell from the title, Through the Ages 2, this project is a sequel to their 2009 compilation, Through the Ages. This one, which was a collection of various unreleased tracks that didn't make the cut for their main albums. I don't consider Through the Ages a main studio album of theirs, despite owning the CD, but if I counted it, then that would most likely rank at the bottom of their projects personal enjoyment-wise. While again, nothing outright bad on there, it's really obvious that it was an outtakes collection made out of tracks that weren't good enough to include on the main albums, and didn't feel like an album in its own right much at all. There is one genuinely great track on there, Eyes Wide Open, clearly a runoff from Natural Selection that probably should have just been on that album. And there's a handful of other pretty solid tracks scattered around it that I still like coming back to every now and then. Though it also has some kind of mediocre cuts where you can kinda tell why they didn't include those on the main albums. Oh, and combine that with that Natural Selection EP that they released near the end of last year, which had 3 extra B-sides that didn't make the above-mentioned 2003 album of the same name. Which, that EP was nice to have, but my favorite track on there was the only one that I'd already heard prior to the EP's release, Idlewild. So I hear that these guys are putting out another collection of B-sides, all dating back to the stuff that they were doing from 2004 to 2014. I didn't exactly jump at the opportunity to hear it. And to make matters worse, they couldn't have possibly gotten more unlucky with the timing of this project's release. Even though they announced it way in advance, and not that anyone could have predicted it, but this project dropped on June 1st, just a few days after the Minneapolis protests made international news, and similar Black Lives Matter protests were breaking out all over the US and commanding everyone's attention immediately, as we were seeing graphic examples of police brutality in action playing out in real time in every major city in the entire country, and our own president more or less declaring war on his own citizens. I can't remember whether that happened yet when this drops, because this past week has just felt like 2 months. As welcoming as I would usually be for more SFTG, I thought, like, this is really not the time to be listening to like down-tempo chill-out stuff, especially since I knew this was just gonna be outtakes. I figured I was just gonna put this in the next Some Stuff I Missed video and get back to it at the end of the month. But I listened to it yesterday out of curiosity while getting some work done at my job, and it turns out that Through the Ages 2 is amazing, and I felt the need to talk about it pretty immediately. Yeah, of course I'm not going to do long negative build-up for one of my favorite artists like that if there isn't a light at the end of the tunnel, and I freaking loved this project right on first listen. It totally hit the spot in a way that I was not prepared for. It completely blows the first Through the Ages out of the water, and even directly addresses many of my misgivings with Binary. This is the SFTG that I've been missing. I didn't realize how much I absolutely needed this right now. Now I will say, before this project dropped, I was already familiar with 2 tracks on here. The track Clover was a random one-off track that they included on a obscure various artists comp. I found it specifically looking for stray 3 SFTG tracks that I'd never heard before years ago, and that track is one of the best tracks they've ever done. It's one of the single most energetic and up-tempo tracks they have, with lots of smooth and gurgling synth lines going up against lively horn sections, grooving bass lines, and a driving and forceful but still light and bouncy beat. And it's just freaking awesome. If absolutely nothing else, going into this comp I was excited to hear this track in actual high quality audio rather than a crappy YouTube rip, and it was every bit as refreshing as I hoped it would be. Clover is probably the best track on this album, however, unlike Eyes Wide Open, it's not the best by like a huge amount. The other ones here are all at least comparable in quality. The other track I knew beforehand was Tomorrow's World Today. This was a minor disappointment since I didn't recognize the title. I thought this was going to be a track that I'd never heard before, but when it first came on I was like, no, hang on, I have definitely heard this before. I think this was even on one of their main albums. And sure enough, this track turned out to be nothing more than a retitling of their track Ink Spots from their Wider World album in 2012. I mean, I do like that track, and Wider World is one of my favorite albums of theirs, but I have no idea why they decided to include a retitled, already released album track on a B-Sides comp. And that was definitely a weird letdown when I figured out what it was. But anyway, the rest of this project is great. Like, Native Soul great. These tracks have texture, they have well-formed identity, they have groove, they have atmosphere, they felt more adventurous, they excited me. Sure, you can tell they were made over the course of several years and don't remotely come together in a cohesive way, but they still deliver exactly what I would want out of new SFTG material. Or old SFTG material from the archives, but whatever. May as well get into the other individual tracks. We start out with Amber, which is a strange place to start out, but really caught me immediately. It's this really slow-building and creepy beatless track that has all these cascades of plunking descending synth lines and various other screeching or whooshing pads and occasionally some guitar plicking come and go around it. It feels very windy and cold and hollow, but in the most compelling and evocative way. There were big chunks of this track that felt like they were clipping the mix and ended up with a rougher texture to the whole thing. Not sure if that's just how it sounds or if it's an artifact of the download, though that particular texture actually does add to the more dramatic feel of the track in parts later on. There's these sections where you got these really menacing bass rumbles and they sound rough and abrasive and really enhance this track's creepy vibe. It's really freaking good. Lemon Sky is another very low-key and often creepy ambient moment that has some kinda more experimental flares occasionally, albeit much less creepy than the opener. The progression of high-pitched pads this track builds itself around is quite welcoming and comforting, but it also has these other pads which are much more airy and ghostly and whoosh around. Not to mention there's these awesome off-key flute riffs later on that just totally pop out in the best way. Dewdrop, that one takes a while to really get going. It has a pretty long and muted intro that didn't particularly grab me, but about a minute in, the beat feels like it really picks up some weight and the bass line really starts to hit. And there are other cool plunking synths that pop in various intervals ranging from these high-pitched melodic lines to more ghostly whooshing pads and other textures. It does come together really nicely again. The whole track kind of reminds me of Rock, Sand, and Clay from Native Soul. Very nice, and that's even one of the low points on this project. Then after Clover bursts in, like the giant ray of sunshine and energy that it is, we get Bag a Moon. This track does have a weirdly long silence tacked on at the end, like a good 30 seconds or so. I'm not sure what that's doing there, but the track itself, it's super striking and immediate. While not texturally that out of the box for them, it has all these really dramatic melodic lines and these plinking sounds somewhere between a harp and a piano that just pierce themselves through the mix, and it instantly had me invested. Also, the warm and comfy pillows of pads that come in later on are very much a welcome touch, as are the sidetracks into the buzzing and squirting bass synth solos over the slapping mechanical beats. Definitely one of my big favorites from here. And then there's 4 AM, which is mainly characterized by that fantastic jazzy upright bass line and beautifully melancholic guitar chords ringing out in the background that have a weirdly Hawaiian texture to them. Also, the really muted and cold pads running through most of it helps the track live up to its title. And do quite like the bleeping electronic textures fading in and out in the beginning, and the lead melodic progressions that show up in the second half. Then there's Entwine, the single vocal track on here featuring frequent guest Taz Alexander. Her appearance on Binary was one of the big highlights of that album, despite the track in question, Missing You, not being anything particularly special for them instrumentally. So I was looking forward to this one, and I think this ranks as the second best track that they did with Taz behind Move On. I mean, nothing's gonna beat that one, but damn, this one just sounds freaking great. Her wailing performance is a lot more impassioned and just makes this thing absolutely soar. And instrumentally, it doesn't sound like any other SFTG track I've ever heard. The percussion is totally 80s sounding. They're super crisp and upfront and punchy, and even have that giant clap sound you might hear on Harold Faltermeyer's Axelef or Herbie Hancock's Rockets, but applied to their typically slow-building rhythms. I did not expect a track like this out of them, but it totally works, and they get these 80s textures to work with their usual atmospheric style in a really cool way. That one's a massive standout, I love it. Speaking of punchy percussion, next we got Ray Gone, one of the more banging tracks on here. The melodies and pads on top aren't the most notable, maybe you got these squirting and screeching almost atonal synths that spurt out through the mix in a cool way. But the various drum textures from its pounding kicks, sharp hi-hats and rim tapping to some breakbeat drum fills really hit hard and give the track some real heaviness. Not a giant standout, but definitely good stuff. It sounds like a leftover from Tribes, maybe, but would have been one of the better ones from that album had it been included. Finally, we close with Wrapped Up Tight, which is primarily built on top of this breakbeat that kinda resembles like a stock garage band loop I've heard before. But still, its bounciness and funkiness and those tambourines work so well into the overall mix, I forget about that initial deja vu pretty quickly. It sounds like a slightly toned-down companion to Clover that also sets itself apart with some very different and perhaps harsher synth textures that work in their own right. And especially really like those progressions of piano chords that show up later. Really like the way they're worked into everything and give the track some more emotional weight. So, yeah, that's Through the Ages 2. It's one of my favorite projects of the year so far. It had that same instantaneous effect on me that that last Fortet album had, and while I don't think this is better, especially given how this is just an outtakes collection and that was obviously a much more properly realized album, this was just an absolute joy to listen to. I'm almost kind of at a loss for words, especially since I was fully expecting to not find this to be a notable entry in their catalog, and they ended up totally flooring me. I really hope they can bring this kind of instrumental muscle and sound design to their next proper studio album whenever that happens, but either way, they have done it again, and any fans of SFTG definitely need to give this one a spin. Not much else to say, old stuff or not, it's freaking great, and I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me a review, something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.